It only took me a couple of hours to understand why Arcanum of Steamworks and Magick Obscura has obtained a sort of cult classic status among fans of CRPGs. Arcanum has the terrible combat you expect in games branded as cult classics, but the world building is excellent and the story manages to circumvent a bunch of fantasy cliches, even when it looks like it's about to run straight into them. Unfortunately, after about 10 hours I realised I didn't enjoy playing Arcanum all that much. I can put up with lackluster combat, but I'm less forgiving of how much Arcanum wastes the player's time with excessive trekking around large towns and far too much time spent pushing through dungeons that are devoid of any interesting content, often feeling like the procedurally generated dungeons of Diablo instead of the typical crafted experience you expect from a CRPG. This is a huge shame because Arcanum is one of the most replayable games I've covered in the series, with probably only Fallout 1 coming close in terms of the impressive variety in which the story can play out, and Arcanum has a greater variety of playstyles for those inclined to experiment. That first Fallout game was perfectly suited to multiple playthroughs. It's a relatively short experience, in CRPG terms anyway, at around 25 hours for a first playthrough, and a lot quicker for subsequent ones. It's a densely packed adventure that crams a lot into its short runtime. Arcanum, on the other hand, has ambitions to be a grand 40 to 80 hour CRPG along the lines of the Baldur's Gate games, but in Arcanum far too many of those hours are spent simply walking from point to point in the large cities or pushing through bland dungeons. The moments of story development and light world building always had me entertained. However, I spent far too many hours slumped back in my chair clicking the mouse as my team slowly traversed empty streets. I intended to complete a second playthrough, and even a third at one point because I was so utterly captivated by all the early options available. In the end, I abandoned the second playthrough halfway through because the game simply couldn't maintain my attention. I had more fun going back through my video footage to reread journals and newspapers and listen to the occasional long bout of exposition. At least that way I could skip past all the dead time, and there was a lot of dead time. You might notice from the gameplay, visuals and world that Arcanum looks a lot like the original Fallout, and that's because Arcanum is the brainchild of Tim Cain, Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson, three of the key developers behind Fallout 1. Cain, Boyarsky and Anderson were initially going to stick around to work on Fallout 2, but they ended up leaving during the early design phase because they couldn't agree with Interplay on the direction for the series. While Fallout 1 and 2 look incredibly similar at first glance, there are major differences that I didn't fully appreciate until my recent playthrough for episodes 1 and 2 of this retrospective series. Fallout 1 is focused on telling one survival-focused story in as many different ways as realistically possible. Fallout 2 is more about making your own stories. In an interview, Cain noted that he didn't like how the major regions of Fallout 2 were being developed independently of one another, and felt the game lacked an overarching theme. My videos on Fallout 1 and 2 contain a lot more detail on the making of those games and how they differ in significant ways, but suffice it to say that I can see where Cain was coming from. In many ways I'd say Fallout 2 has more in common with Fallout 3 than the original, but that's probably a story for a Fallout 3 video. Following this disagreement, Cain, Boyarsky and Anderson formed their own company, Troika Games, and started to work on their own projects. By the way, Troika means a group of 3 people working together in Russian. Cain knew he wanted to make another RPG, but beyond that there were no concrete ideas. Much like when they were developing Fallout, the firm plan was to avoid making a standard D&D style fantasy game. Boyarsky came up with the idea of a game set during the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution, and the end result was a mixture of traditional fantasy races like elves, dwarves, ogres and orcs, alongside humans and steampunk style technology. Troika Games was very much playing to its strengths with this setting. Despite being set in the future, Fallout's technology didn't develop like our own, splitting off in around the 1950s with a focus on fusion tech, and everything is a lot larger than you'd expect because the capacitor wasn't invented at the same time. That's why Fallout can feel both futuristic and old-fashioned at the same time. Arcanum has a similar feel, with lots of cool and imaginative technology to play around with, but not the sort of technology we are used to. Troika Games signed a publishing deal with Sierra Entertainment, but with a team of just 12 people they were under a lot of pressure, and development was described as a constant state of crunch. Troika Games had a rough time trying to meet deadlines, and Sierra wasn't exactly generous with the time frame. As a result, Arcanum released with a distinct lack of polish and with more bugs than a game jointly produced by BioWare and Bethesda Game Studios. Reviews praised Arcanum's story and world but criticised the combat and performance. It's hard to argue with any of those points. Arcanum's sales were solid at around $250,000 and the game reportedly made a profit, although not a huge one. There were plans for a sequel called Journey to the Centre of Arcanum, which would have been a first-person game in Valve's Source engine. The game fell through when Sierra had a bust-up with Valve and there wasn't enough interest in a sequel to attract another publisher. Troika Games ended up signing a deal with a new publisher to make Temple of Elemental Evil, but that's a story for another video. As you can probably tell, I've used a couple of mods here, mainly the high resolution mod to play in 720p. You can play in 1080p as well, and that's what you see in some of the very early footage. However, in 1080 I found it tricky to see items on the ground. 720p was a good happy medium. Arcanum's greatest strength is the underlying conflict between magic and technology, which not only plays out in the world building and story, but also forms a crucial part of the combat and even character creation. When creating a backstory for a character in CRPGs, I tend to focus more on the character's personality and skill set than I do their actual history. I decide in advance roughly where the protagonist is going to be on the good, evil, lawful, chaotic spectrum and pick a class. I don't dwell on their personal history too much because usually the game gives you just enough to work with while also restricting the use of backstories. Fallout 1 starts off as you leave Vault 13 to get a water chip. Sure, you can come up with a wide range of things that can happen to your character before that point, but you also know they spent their entire lives in the vault and the potential for adventure is therefore limited. Fallout 2 offered a little more flexibility because we grew up in the wasteland, albeit in a small village, and we knew we were the grandchild of the vault dweller from Fallout 1. In Baldur's Gate we were Gorion's ward and spent our entire lives inside the walls of Candlekeep before the start of the story. In Planescape Torment the playable character has amnesia, so assuming you're getting into the role-playing spirit you can't go and create a backstory beyond what's shown in the game. There are games that completely break with this tradition, such as Icewind Dale. However, as I discussed in that video, the ability to create a full backstory doesn't compensate for the complete lack of a character-driven story. It's going from one extreme to the other. Arcanum not only gives you the freedom to roleplay that you'd expect from a CRPG, it also offers a world in which you'll want to get into the role-playing spirit. Fantasy CRPGs are often about the balance of good versus evil, and while you're often presented with the choice of choosing a side, it's rarely an interesting choice. The story always plays out in much the same way regardless of whether you're good or evil, and you plough through the same enemies using the same skills. It doesn't make much of a difference if your berserker dwarf is good or evil, he's going to swing the same axe in the same way at largely the same enemies. Your alignment might affect your choice of companions, but as we've seen in this video series, companions aren't well fleshed out. Arcanum retains the good/evil split, and yes, your morality affects who will join you in the quest, but the role of magic and technology in the world adds another layer on top, which is not only more important to your journey, it's also much more interesting. The use of magic and technology flows through every element of Arcanum. The power of magic and those who wield it has dominated Arcanum for thousands of years, but there's been a recent explosion in the use of technology, led by humans, and the power of magic seems to be on the wane. The rise of the machines creates disputes between employers and employees, with talk of unions being an ever-present threat to the status quo. We saw similar issues play out in our own industrial revolution, and there's still a constant debate over the use of technology and where restrictions should be placed. I couldn't wait to dive into Troika's world and see how it all played out there. Unfortunately, I may have dived in a little too quickly, and as a result there were a few abandoned playthroughs before I settled on a character I was happy with. Because Arcanum looks so much like a Fallout game, I thought it would be interesting to play as a mage and see how magic fit in a world with guns and trains. But mages of some sort have been an option in the last 5 CRPGs I've played, and I fancied a change. I ended up going the tech route and focusing on the gunslinger tech tree. That means I ended up playing Arcanum a bit like Fallout, but these games are still the exception, not the rule, so I think it was a good choice. As for the species, I knew I didn't want to play as any variant of an elf or dwarf because elves are the traditional magic users and dwarves technology users, and I knew from my abandoned attempts that they were going to be crucial to the story. I like to act as a sort of neutral middleman when there are these kind of long-running disputes so that I can be a little more flexible when I make decisions. I considered variants like the halfling, however you can't play as a female halfling, and the adventures of Big Sue's must continue. Apparently the lack of female characters for certain species was a result of art and memory limitations, but it seems odd given that you can barely tell the sexes apart anyway. My female protagonist started in a dress, but once she had proper armour on she was indistinguishable from the male characters. I went with a human because I thought they would provide the risk-free default race which is often the role they fulfill. Although as it turned out humans play a significant role in the story and are the race that caused many of the problems to begin with due to their aggressive use of new technology. I gave my protagonist a bit more background than usual. Instead of just being good or evil with a certain skill trait, she was to be an optimistic young woman who believed passionately in the benefits that technology can bring. To her, magic is something from history books. She's heard legends of what magic was capable of, and yet modern magic usage is far tamer, and she suspects these stories are exaggerated. With the lovable naivety and optimism of youth, she is absolutely convinced that technology is the way forward and that magic will die out and not be missed. Some decisions were forced on me. Whoever you create, you have to be new to the land of Arcanum, having recently arrived from another continent, and you are around the age of maturity. For humans that's 20 years old, for elves 200, for dwarves 100 and so on. There's no good reason for the age to be fixed and it's a little disappointing, although it worked well for my main playthrough because I wanted my character to be relatively young anyway. It just seems like an unnecessary limitation on roleplaying. Also, you don't age even though years pass during the game. You're also highly encouraged to accept a certain backstory of sorts, with around 50 in total to choose from. I'm slightly torn on these. At first it was great flicking through a bunch of pre-made character backgrounds and looking at the influence those backgrounds had on the character's starting statistics. Some are fairly tame. For example, if you play as a woman, you start with 1 point less in strength and 1 extra in constitution when compared to a man. However, you can choose a tomboy background which reverses this change. Similarly, elves are more adept with magic and dwarves with technology, so you can expect to see minor adjustments to stats like willpower and intelligence if you play as them. Much more interesting are the extreme changes that see you classed as troll offspring with a huge hit to your beauty, or classed as being raised in the pits, which offers generous physical bonuses in exchange for -6 to your intelligence. This was all captivating at first. Preset characters are usually dull, and there are a couple of complete presets here as well if you want to use them, but these backgrounds still let you choose how to allocate an additional 5 points, so it seems like a decent balance between having the freedom to create the character you want and getting a bit of inspiration from the game itself. However, as I looked through all the different options for all the different races, it started to feel unnecessarily restrictive. If you're going to be given this much choice, why not just let you allocate all the points yourself? Most players will find a build they like from the list, but there's also a decent chance something about the background won't quite fit. What if you like the idea of a character with a natural affinity for magic who is also afraid of the dark? Unfortunately, those two backgrounds conflict. Or maybe you want your character to start off poor instead of rich. Or you like the tech-focused human but want to be ugly and charismatic as well, or vice versa. It's a little odd, but something that initially seemed to offer up so many new options ended up feeling restrictive. It's weird how being given more options in some ways only serves to highlight the lack of options in other places. The only background I could find that gave me the required boosts to charisma, intelligence and perception was one where I was born to a wealthy family but lost my sight to a degenerative disease, which meant I favoured indoor activities growing up and became a little weak as a result. My family then lost its fortune paying for an unorthodox surgery to restore my eyesight. I went with this background just because I wanted the stats, not because any of this really appealed to me. Once you've selected your gender, race and background, if any, you move on to one of the most hideous character creation screens my eyes have ever had the misfortune to witness. Tim Cain himself has admitted that the UI here is dreadful, stating that the team didn't really have any UI designers on staff at the time, to which the phrase "no shit Sherlock" seems especially apt.
But still, I would completely change how I would design this today. You'd think I'd learn from this mistake, but here's Arcanum's UI, which is even worse. It may look prettier, but it's got more attributes, it has more skills. I know the laser pointer doesn't work, but like the buttons on the top right change what that panel below it displays, and that panel itself has buttons that display what that change what it displays. So rather than put in less skills and less spells and less technical skills, what I did is I just hid them so it didn't look complicated. So I didn't scare Sierra, who was publishing it, but still it was a very complicated game for people to get into.
It's an absolute disaster, and I'm going to go through it all because while it's a complete mess, the character build is an absolutely crucial part of understanding Arcanum, and I want to put you through what I went through. I admire Troika's ambition here even though it doesn't pan out. Kane described Arcanum as his kitchen sink game where he just shoved everything in, and nowhere is that more apparent than on the character creation screen. The character attributes themselves are simple enough. There are 8 in total, 4 physical, 4 mental. This will be familiar to anyone who has played an RPG before, although there are a few things worth pointing out. There's a beauty stat which is quite unusual and affects how people react when they first meet you. If you have a low beauty stat but high charisma, you will still be able to win people over though, and beauty doesn't help much if you act like a jerk all the time. Reactions from NPCs are fairly widespread and go a long way to making the game world feel alive. In addition to reacting to your looks, NPCs also treat you differently depending on your race, with elves being treated harshly in places with a lot of technology, for example. Best of all, if you happen to be practically naked, NPCs always comment on it, with reactions ranging from disgust to a polite recommendation that you might want to cover up a bit. According to Kane, these lines of dialogue were included because players treat it as a test of sorts, often getting naked and judging the game by the variety of responses, if any. The rest of the ability choices are much the same as Fallout, with willpower replacing luck. That's all simple enough, but then there's the rest of the screen. The derived stats you see at the bottom aren't especially informative at the beginning because there's no context for what is good or bad. As you play, you can obviously keep an eye on increases and decreases, but as standalone information it's fairly useless and in one case quite misleading. There's a stat referred to as AC adjustment, with AC standing for armor class. Anyone who's played any of the D&D based CRPGs I've covered in this series, or well, even actual D&D, will know that the lower the armor class the better. Starting off with an AC adjustment of -5 sounds great. However, in Arcanum it's the higher the better for armor class. This might have been a deliberate nod and wink to how silly the system is in D&D, because when it explains armor class in the manual it states, quote, "A higher AC is more desirable than a lower AC, naturally," close quote, as if any other way of doing it would be stupid. It's a fair point, don't get me wrong, but using the specific term armor class and then flipping its meaning is a bit of a dick move. If you play around with the base attributes you can see how they change the derived stats, although like I said, without knowing what values are considered good and bad, you're still playing in the dark a little bit. Strength impacts carry capacity, dexterity, speed, charisma, maximum followers, that kind of thing. On the far left is a standard alignment meter with a swing to the left representing evil behaviour and a swing to the right being good. There are no official classes, but you can use the skill system to develop a class of sorts. That silver box on the right contains 4 different groups of 4 skills. If you want to be a rogue, you should pick things like lockpicking, spotting traps and disarming traps. My character was going to be a charismatic gunslinger, so I focused on firearms, repair because I figured guns would need a lot of repair work, and persuasion. I can never resist options like persuasion because I want to try and talk my way out of combat where possible. It's kind of my test of a good CRPG instead of getting naked in busy towns. Other soft skills like haggling and gambling can help you get items on the cheap. Gambling isn't success at dice or poker, it's for when you gamble for items with shopkeepers. Now things start to get really messy because this collection of 16 skills is only 1/3 of the options in this box. You can also allocate skill points into one of 16 different schools of magic, which each have their own list of spells that unlock the more points you have. And there are 8 different branches of technology, again each with different skills unlocking each time you spend points. First of all, the UI here is a mess. With hindsight, it's obvious the cog icon is supposed to represent technology, however it also looks like the icon for a settings menu, and next to it is the icon for magic, which looks almost identical to the icon for the world map. I think it's supposed to be a pair of hands, but it's not clear. On my very first attempt at this screen before reading the manual, I didn't even notice these options and was thoroughly confused by the line chart on the right hand side, which shows how you're balanced between magic and tech abilities. Finally, in the top right there's a random icon that you can click to choose between a bunch of preset auto level schemes, which I didn't use but they're a nice touch regardless. Well, so long as you actually notice them. UI issues are a problem, but ultimately you do get used to this kind of stuff. As you can tell, there are a lot of options for your character build, which usually I'd consider a good thing if it weren't for one small issue. All of the attributes and skills require the same character points to level up. You get 1 point per level, or 2 for levels 10, 20 and so on, and with those points you have to choose between levelling up one of the 8 attributes, one of the 16 skills, one of the 16 schools of magic, or one of the 8 technology disciplines. Oh, and you can also separately level up your health and stamina, although these can also be improved through boosting constitution and willpower, which have added benefits like poison resistance, so I don't recommend you level these things separately. So in total, every time you level up and get 1 character point, you can choose between 50 different places to put that point, and each place has room for at least 5 points as you level up the skill or attribute. The level cap is 50. This is terrible, and it's so obviously terrible that I'm amazed it's in the game. Just off the top of my head, it would make more sense to have a level cap of around 20, with each level awarding character points that you can use to improve the base attributes, and a separate set of points, say skill points, that could be allocated to skills. You know, like the system in Fallout, the game Tim Kaine and co made before this. Imagine playing Fallout with twice as many options, but every option could only be changed with a solitary character point per level. I have my suspicions that an early build of Arcanum did have skills that worked like those in Fallout. If you look at the tech skills, there is an ability number out of 100, which goes up every time you invest a point in that part of the tree. I reckon originally you dumped points into these skills with a separate skill point system and it was changed late on. Having a number out of 100 doesn't make a lot of sense when you're only investing 1 point at a time up to a maximum of 7. This system becomes mind-blowingly stupid when you start crafting items like guns, bullets and explosives. Let's say you find a nice new schematic and you want to craft an elixir of hypnotic suggestion. You'll need an 85 in chemicals and 56 in therapeutics. These numbers don't mean anything by themselves. You need to invest in levels, but how many levels out of 7 does it take to reach 56 out of 100? Hint, you don't get an even amount of points per level. It really feels like the system was designed to be much more like Fallout, where you had say 20 skill points to allocate per level gained, and you could spread them around a bit more. This isn't just me backseat developing, by the way. When discussing Fallout 4, Kaine admits that he doesn't like the system that sees you using the same points to improve base attributes and also unlock new skills. This is essentially the same system that Arcanum uses, so I think it's fair to say he probably regrets a few decisions here.
I like Fallout 4. People always ask me, what do you think Bethesda does? I like 3, I liked 4, I love New Vegas. They're just doing it differently than I do it, but different isn't bad. One of the things they've done is every time they've put out a new Fallout, they've gotten rid of something. So Fallout 3, there were no traits anymore. Fallout 4, they actually got rid of skills, which may be going a little too far, but the character creation looked really simple. This was, I pick my 7, my special stats, and I'm off into the game. But then you get to the perk tree, which is now arranged under your stats. This is a small fraction of it. It's actually a lot bigger. It's a little overwhelming. When I first started, I was like, oh shoot, I'm going to be limited to the perks at the top because of my attributes. And then I realized you can raise your attributes, which means they're not really a constraint anymore. You can end up the game with all 10s if you just keep playing long enough. So I just keep thinking, there's got to be something better you can do than this.
With so many options, it's perhaps not a huge surprise that there are some balance issues. While I didn't complete the entire game with a mage, from my experience with that build, it does seem that mages are a bit of a built-in easy mode of sorts. The harm spell is incredibly useful, and if you like a bit of cheese with your CRPGs, you can always spam it until you ran out of stamina and then rest an hour in nearly all locations anyway, and your stamina bar will be refilled. Throw-based builds feel overpowered due to how easy it is to craft Molotov cocktails, and melee builds are great because you don't need to focus on too many different stats, with strength and dexterity being by far the most important. And from there you can perhaps add some tech skills to build cool melee weapons like Tesla rods. Dexterity is a crucial stat. Regardless of your build, dexterity is important because it's used for dodging enemy attacks. Regardless of what build you choose for your character, nearly all of your opponents fight up close and personal. Being a ranged combatant, in my case a gunslinger, means getting shots in early and then watching enemies run towards you as you try to get another shot off before they start swinging at you. And they will swing at you and not your companions at least 80% of the time. Enemies rarely use ranged weapons, so you can't tactically decide to send in melee combatants to occupy other melee fighters while you and the ranged enemies go up against each other. While this might sound biased or like me complaining about difficulty, I really do believe that gunslingers are screwed, or at least have things a bit tougher than average. In addition to having to contend with melee combat whether you want to or not, gunslingers also have to spread points across a wide variety of disciplines to remain competent. And I found myself constantly in a state of waiting to level up enough to unlock the next blueprint or get the required stats to wield the new weapon. A gunslinger needs to dump points into the gunsmith part of the tech tree, which gets you access to new gun blueprints. Before doing this, you need to ensure that your intelligence is high enough, with the later guns needing an intelligence stat of 19 to craft. Even with my high starting intelligence of 11, I had to dump 8 more points in there before I could even think about unlocking the schematics to the best guns. After you've spent points to learn the schematic, you can then craft the gun, but to use it effectively you need to invest in the firearm skill as well. That's about enough to worry about in my opinion. You've got a character who's intelligent enough to build the guns that you acquire through blueprints, and a specific firearm skill to use them. That should be the end of it, but of course it's not. Perception is also crucial for using guns effectively, so you can't ignore that ability. You needed perception in Fallout as well, although I'd argue that if you have a separate skill for firearms that requires you to use the same points that you would put into attributes, it's an unnecessary bit of overlap. In fact, they're even linked, so the bonuses from levelling up the firearm skill are directly dependent on your perception. Given that the only benefit of note for perception is specifically the ability to use ranged weapons, which is either guns or bows, this feels a bit redundant. On a minor note, you can't ignore dexterity and constitution as a gunslinger because, as I stated, most enemies use melee weapons, and therefore the ability to avoid and consume heavy damage is crucial. There isn't much opportunity to create a glass cannon build. There are of course healing items and specific healers, however as we'll see later on, if you have a tech build a lot of those items and the healers themselves won't be able to heal you because you're resistant to magic. So far that's 4 major parts of your build to focus on plus 2 attributes that need a few points dumped in every now and again. We're not done. Guns need bullets and they aren't cheap. You could put points into haggle or gambling and try to get cheaper bullets that way, or you can craft your own from resources out in the world once you have found the requisite schematic. However, even with the schematic you need to invest a point into explosives, but that is at least a one-off. Something like the tranquilizer gun however requires a heavy investment in chemicals in addition to gunsmithing. I found all this a bit annoying. It was frustrating to get the schematic for bullets and finally think I better craft bullets, and then realise I needed to wait until I'd leveled up to put a point into explosives. However, what really pushed me over the edge was when I realised I needed to dump a load of points into strength to use the guns that I just crafted. Crafting a new gun isn't easy. You typically need 2 other good guns or maybe 1 gun and a part like a looking glass. And that's not counting the investment of points in intelligence and gunsmith to unlock the blueprints in the first place. You're not told about the strength requirements in advance either. So imagine spending say 6 levels worth of character points to get your intelligence to the right level, then spending a couple of more to unlock the gun blueprint, then sacrificing 2 of your most powerful guns, only to be rewarded with a gun that you can't use for another 5 levels because your strength isn't high enough. I understand that a high strength stat is sometimes required for big beefy weapons like rocket launchers, but we're talking nothing bigger than a rifle here. Yes, there is some kickback, but the level of strength you need is comparable to that required to swing a huge sword while decked in a full suit of armour. It doesn't make any sense. And on top of all this, don't forget that in my build I also wanted to play a charismatic character, which meant not only putting points in charisma but also the persuasion skill. I don't think I was being overly ambitious trying to have a character who focused on guns and being generally charming. My build was pretty narrow. I ignored all the 16 schools of magic and only upgraded other tech trees as required to build the guns I had unlocked. I was a 100% tech focused character on the tech magic alignment scale, and yet the only tech I could build was guns and the bullets to go in them. When I unlocked other cool stuff like the mechanical spiders later on in the game, there was nothing I could do with them. In other words, I don't think I spread myself too thin, although the game acted like I had. Oh, and there's one more thing which I'm convinced screws over gunslingers, and that is the way XP is awarded. As you'd expect, you get some XP per kill, with any kills by your companions also counting. However, most XP is awarded on a per hit basis, and for the per hit XP you don't get the XP earned by companions. Most guns are not particularly fast, and the most powerful gun is fairly slow. The best way to approach combat as a gunslinger is generally to get a shot in from long range before the fight has even started. I mean, it's silly to not play to your strengths after all. My character was brilliant at this thanks to all the points I'd put into perception and firearms. However, guns like the Looking Glass rifle, basically a sniper rifle, and the Elephant gun don't fire all that quickly. As a result, you don't get many hits in during combat, especially when compared to a melee build character who probably has a high dexterity anyway, which leads to more attacks for them. In other words, as a gunslinger you level really slowly, and the XP system punishes you for having the tenacity to engage in slower, more tactical combat. It's possible other build types have similar issues to the gunslinger builds, throw-based builds come to mind, but I can't play through the entire game as every build type, and it didn't take much time to notice the glaring differences between playing as a melee character versus a gunslinger when it comes to where you need to dump points to be effective. All in all, it feels like Troika Games was a little too ambitious when it came to the character builds and the resulting combat system. The combat of Fallout 1 wasn't exactly great, and there the developers only had to focus on guns and melee combat for the most part. With the addition of a huge magic system, not to mention crafting your own gear, there's a lot more going on this time, and unfortunately Troika wasn't up to the task. Perhaps the biggest problem is that Troika had to juggle two different combat systems for Arcanum. There's real-time combat and turn-based combat. The real-time combat is the default option, however it also feels like the less thought out choice, with barely a paragraph devoted to explaining real-time combat in the manual. Now supposedly Sierra Entertainment insisted on the inclusion of real-time combat, although I can't find any support for that. Tim Cain does do a lot of interviews and video presentations, so it's certainly possible I missed it. It's hard to search for things that were included in videos. I'm hesitant to blame Sierra without proof, but it does certainly sound like something a publisher would have done in the early 2000s, when most CRPGs were real-time and Diablo and its sequel had taken the world by storm. As discussed in my Fallout 1 video, Interplay wanted Fallout 1 to be real-time as well, so this rumour fits with what I've heard elsewhere about industry practice at the time. The turn-based combat will look familiar to those who played Fallout 1 or 2, although it's worse than those due to a lack of information and feedback. Each character has a set number of action points for each turn, and the number of points available is determined by dexterity, another reason why that stat is so crucial. Turn-based mode is particularly advantageous for characters like my gunslinger because they can maintain a decent distance from enemies and get one shot per round. One nice touch is that if you don't have enough action points left you can still attack, and you will consume stamina points instead. This was a huge deal for me because my gunslinger would have never been able to move and shoot in one turn with her low dexterity. While you can see how much damage you do on each hit, there's no information on hit probability from distance, and my character was inconsistent with the range at which she would shoot from, or whether she would shoot through companions or other enemies, or if she would shoot at all. Sometimes she needed a clear shot, other times it didn't seem to matter. You can target attacks at certain body parts, head, arms and legs, however you often need to move in closer before attacking this way, and the game doesn't tell you when this applies. It wasn't uncommon for me to select a headshot from what I thought was a sensible range, only to watch my character walk right up next to the enemy instead and not shoot, waiting patiently for the next turn. Turn-based suffers from the fact that it's, well, turn-based and therefore destined to be boring by default, although perhaps the bigger problem is not having control over your companions, who proceed to act in the absolute dumbest ways. The most consistent and annoying problem I came across involved the healer Virgil, who would keep trying to heal my character both in and out of combat whenever I was low on health. That doesn't sound like a huge problem, however my character was a tech specialist, and at the higher levels magic doesn't work on tech characters, or it works so rarely it's a waste of time to try. Virgil couldn't comprehend this, so he would constantly waste his entire stamina bar trying to heal me, only for each spell to fizzle out with no effect. Other companions would look on eagerly waiting for their own chance to get healed, but nope, Virgil would keep trying until his stamina was entirely depleted. He'd even do this during conversations with NPCs, so sometimes you'd be talking to people and all you can hear is the constant fizzling noise of failed spells. While it would make some battles take longer, it would be a hell of a lot more efficient if I could control what everyone did. If you're going to make me engage with a turn-based system, the least you could do is offer complete control. This kind of half-assed middle ground isn't satisfying. While turn-based isn't the default option, it does seem to be the one the difficulty curve was built around. Combat is certainly easier in this mode compared to real-time, which is often just a chaotic mess. In real-time there's no stamina loss if you attack without enough action points, because there are no action points in this mode. Everyone just spams their attacks as quickly as possible. You can in theory set it so that your character auto-attacks enemies, although this seems to be more reaction-based. They will attack when attacked, but won't be proactive or move on to another target until you tell them. Unless you can react as quickly as the computer, and you can't, you're always going to be less efficient than the enemies, which puts you at an immediate disadvantage. You can't slow the fights down either. Well, you kind of can, but it's a bug that we'll talk about later. However, you can switch the action back to turn-based at any point if you need a breather. With the frantic pace of the action, it's hard to be picky about what spells you throw out, and God forbid you want to do anything tactical like choose who you shoot at. There's also a tendency for crazy stuff to happen that you can easily miss, like one companion dropping a weapon due to a critical fail, and then another companion immediately picking it up. I felt absolutely hopeless watching these fights play out. The one major advantage the real-time combat has over turn-based is that it's easier to run around kiting enemies if you want. Other than that, you're basically pissing into the wind. With all that said, as you might have noticed from the footage, I've nearly always used real-time combat, but that says more about my hatred of turn-based combat, particularly the turn-based combat here, than it does the quality of the real-time combat. When both systems are bad, you might as well pick the one which gets it over with quicker. Real-time combat is much harder, mind you, so for the tougher fights I would either switch it over to turn-based or play on easy for a bit. Easy mode gives you more XP, so I felt this kind of made up for the XP I wasn't getting based on hits. With regards to the overall difficulty, it's mostly fine or even fairly easy the majority of the time, but there are some significant difficulty spikes, and it's hard to know what to expect from any new area. There are also oddities like still facing level 8 enemies when you're in the mid-20s, and those level 8 enemies somehow still being quite tough. The difficulty spikes can of course be a huge pain. You can stroll along for 10 plus hours without a problem, head into a dungeon, make it to the end, and then suddenly find you're dramatically unprepared for a fight. The good news is that you can sometimes talk your way out of fights, which is why I don't regret my choice to put points into charisma and persuasion, even though it meant spreading those precious points around even more. Early on it was basic stuff like talking my way out of a fight with some thugs at the bridge in the starter town, but nothing out of the ordinary. Fortunately, having a high persuasion does really pay off later on. I was able to avoid entire dungeons, such as when I talked to Randver of the Wheel Clan, who let me take a shortcut straight to his father, instead of the far more challenging and likely more tedious route there. Similarly, there's one point during a side quest where you're investigating a series of murders, and it turns out that the guilty party is a demon called Lana Malak. To defeat him, you need the Blade of Xerxes, so you trot off to the appropriate dungeon, except you aren't the first ones there. Another group of intrepid adventurers also wants the blade, and if you're persuasive enough you can convince them how important the blade is and not only have them stand aside, but have them go in and get it for you, avoiding the need for a bunch of fights. Of course there's not much you can do about random encounters or fights as you trawl through dungeons, but for the most part I was happy with how Arcanum let me use the persuasion skill to talk my way out of combat. The big test is always the final boss. With Arcanum having been developed by the same people who created the encounter with the Master at the end of Fallout 1, I had high hopes and I wasn't disappointed, or at least I wasn't once I googled the requirements to get the non-violent ending. I foolishly assumed that having my persuasion skill as high as it could be would be enough to persuade the boss not to fight, but it turns out you actually need your charisma to be maxed out at 20. Given that you don't need charisma of 20 to unlock any of the associated skills, I can't imagine many people have this one maxed out. It's a much more specific and tougher to achieve requirement than that of Fallout 1's encounter. Missing out on this ending as punishment for not completing certain side quests would be fair enough, but needing to max out charisma is a little weird. At least the option is there though. You can even talk your way out of some encounters without good charisma or persuasion, if you've done the research. For example, throughout the game you're pursued by a group of assassins called the Molochean Hand, and eventually you confront their leader, Gideon. If you follow through on some previous side quests, you might know a bit about the Molochean Hand's history, which you can use to your advantage, such as by telling Gideon that he's effectively doing the work of Aranax, the big bad. The Molochean hand was used for evil ends in the past, and it doesn't want to make the same mistake. Gideon will leave you be, and finally all those assassination attempts come to an end. Where Arcanum really comes to life is in the storytelling and world building. Despite featuring elves, dwarves, orcs, ogres, etc., Arcanum isn't a typical high fantasy story, and it goes out of its way to push back against many of the tropes. Part of this is through the setting itself. Arcanum's mixture of new technology and the old ways with the inclusion of a magic system is unusual enough that I can't think of an obvious comparison. That said, I'm not a huge steampunk guy, so it's possible there are plenty of worlds like this one and I just don't know about them. Arcanum's setting feels like an epilogue set hundreds or even thousands of years after a grand fantasy story, and I absolutely love that. Whenever media revisits fantasy worlds, it's typically to tell prequel stories or side stories. It's rare to see a sequel for the obvious reason that the original story probably ended with the defeat of the big bad that haunted the world for thousands of years. How do you make a sequel to Lord of the Rings? If you do follow the story, then you tend to rely on the existing characters, and if you're not careful, you might destroy what came before by rushing out a new big bad, and essentially making the events of the original story pointless. In the world of Arcanum, a bunch of huge stories have already played out, but the world has moved on and now it's time for another story. The closest comparison I can think of is the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, who you're probably tired of me mentioning at this point. The original Mistborn trilogy is crying out to be adapted into a video game series, but anyway, while it's not high fantasy, it takes place in a typical fantasy time period. In other words, there's little in the way of technology or guns, and there is a magic system of sorts. The trilogy was suitably epic, but when it was finished, Sanderson still wanted to write more books set in this world. Instead of just skipping forward 10 or 20 years, he went forward 300 years and created what I believe will end up being a series of 4 books that are more like westerns with a bit of magic than traditional fantasy. I'm sure this sort of thing is incredibly challenging to do as a writer, but it's also really rewarding for the reader. It doesn't take away from the original stories, as sequels set in the near future tend to do, and it even elevates them by reminding you that you read a story that was part of a living, breathing world. A world that will one day move on and become unrecognisable from the one you know. Arcanum isn't technically a sequel to another story, at least not directly, however there's a lot of history to this world and it ends up playing into the story. The manual sets this all up perfectly, starting off with a fake history book describing the world of Arcanum. According to this history book, humans are the oldest race, able to trace their history back 2 million years, and it's theorised that elves, giants and orcs were the result of human experiments with magic. Some believe that elves are actually the older race, which fits in with the typical fantasy narrative, although the point is up for debate. The manual does a great job setting the stage, although the story is a little heavy-handed at the beginning and induced more than a few eye rolls. The intro movie shows you on a blimp which is shot down by ogres piloting planes. There are only 2 survivors, you and some random old gnome who doesn't last much longer. Just before he dies, he hands you a ring and asks you to take it to the boy. After stumbling out of the blimp wreckage, you meet Virgil, who upon seeing you as the sole survivor brands you as the living one and claims you're the reincarnation of the elven god Nasrudin. Virgil is a member of a religious group called the Panerai who worship the teachings of Nasrudin and believe he will be resurrected one day for another big battle with the evil Aranax, who Nasrudin banished to the void thousands of years ago. The prophecy dictated that Nasrudin would be reborn on wings of fire, which does fit the blimp crash pretty well. I didn't have high hopes for the story at this point due to the obvious lack of any personal motivation, which actually is a problem throughout the story. The only real motivation for your own character is finding out why people are trying to kill her. Despite the lack of a strong personal connection to events, I ended up finding the story more than engaging enough to stick with it, and once you get past the first act, there are plenty of mysteries to uncover and problems to solve. I still think that stories are better when the protagonist has a strong reason to push events forward, being proactive instead of reactive, but sometimes the underlying events are interesting enough that you are proactive just because you want to uncover what's going on. Following the trail of the ring leads you to its owner Gilbert Bates, an industrialist in the technologically advanced city of Tarrant. Bates is credited with the invention of the steam engine among other things, but after talking to him you discover that, well, he had a little help. He took the secrets of these technologies from the dwarves of the Black Mountain clan, and the gnome who gave you the ring was not a gnome but in fact a dwarf called Stenna Rockcutter, who took the unusual step of shaving his beard off to remain undetected. Bates tells you that the Black Mountain clan has now gone missing and he pays you to find out what happened to them, feeling guilty for his potential role in their disappearance. Tracking down the Black Mountain clan has us following a few red herrings, but eventually we find the king of the Wheel clan, Locaire Thunderstone, who has exiled himself into the mines and left his son in charge as punishment to himself for his role in banishing the Black Mountain clan. The dwarves of the Black Mountain clan weren't just banished from the mountains, they were banished permanently to a place known as the Void. I never found a concrete description of what the Void actually is, but it sounds like another plane of reality, perhaps like the Phantom Zone from Superman stories. As we see near the end, it isn't a particularly nice place, however it probably wasn't always this way. The Void contains traces of civilization dating back thousands of years, and what happened to them is unknown. Unfortunately for the clan, once you've been banished to the Void there is no way back. It's a severe punishment restricted to the baddest of the bad. The most infamous banishments were Aranax, the one the Parari believe will return to Arcanum to battle the Living One, i.e. us. Krakatur was banished after killing Arcanum's last remaining dragon and using its blood to become half human, half dragon, and Gorgoth was a beast who would eat, well, pretty much any living being. Finally there's Kurgan, who discovered dark magic and was banished for his experiments on the souls of the dead. You might expect the Black Mountain clan to have done something truly horrific to earn such a fate, however that's certainly not the case. Their big crime was to have shared the secrets of their technology with humans through Gilbert Bates. That's it. They didn't even do it deliberately, Gilbert Bates effectively stole the technology from them. When the elves found out, they were so annoyed that they demanded Thunderstone hand the Black Mountain clan over for banishment. Thunderstone complied, believing the alternative was a great war between elves and dwarves that would undoubtedly have spread all over Arcanum. Banishing one clan was seen as the option of lesser evil. His guilt over this compelled him to abdicate and leave his son in charge. Making sense of all this requires an understanding of the role of technology and magic in Arcanum's world. Magic and technology coexist, but only barely. It's a careful balancing job, and Thunderstone explains the dilemma perfectly. This conversation with Thunderstone completely won me over to Arcanum's story. If I'd been a little on the fence before this point, I was now on board. Magic and technology don't complement each other. Magic can cause technology to break. So for example, if you want to take a train you have to answer a bunch of questions about whether you or your companions are magic users. If you are, you have to sit in third class at the back of the train to avoid causing problems with the engine. If you're an especially powerful magic user, you might not be allowed on the train at all. Magic users are also worried about the impact technology is having on magic. The power of magic is draining from the world, and some suspect the increase in technology usage is behind that. While elves predominantly use magic and dwarves technology, they don't hate each other as is so often the case in fantasy stories. The two species have lived in peace for thousands of years. There wasn't any particular conflict until the dwarves passed their secrets to Bates. Spreading knowledge may not seem like a huge crime, but as Thunderstone tells us, humans treat technology differently to dwarves because humans don't live as long and therefore aren't always around to see the consequences of their actions. Humans only think about whether they can do something, not whether they should.
When Bates was given a look at our technology, he was overcome. As a human, his first thought was, what can I use this for? When it should have been, what is the cost of its use? Technology exploded in their hands because they are not burdened with our longevity. Humans rarely live long enough to see the consequences of their mistakes.
The elves took particular umbrage at humans using steam-powered machines to clear entire forests that had stood in place for thousands of years. Dwarves would never have done such a thing because they also feel a strong connection to the earth. Thunderstone's speech is powerful and easy to relate to. Imagine how different our own world would be if humans lived for, say, 400 years instead of around 75. Discussion around things like climate change would be completely different for a start. We wouldn't speak of it in terms of our children's future, but well, in terms of our own. Dwarves and elves want magic and technology to coexist and work for the long term, whereas humans just want to see how far they can push things. This reminds me a bit of the world of The Witcher, mainly the books, where a world that was previously inhabited by elves and dwarves suddenly has to contend with humans who only want to destroy and conquer. With this new information, we track down the elves, but they deny all involvement in the banishment of the Black Mountain clan. It turns out the banishment was the work of a splinter group referred to as the Dark Elves. The hunt for their hidden city leads to some decent quests as you track them down, and uncover a potential curse on a book about the Dark Elves, whose owners have all mysteriously been murdered. After infiltrating the Dark Elves, you learn that the banishment of the clan was all part of a bigger conspiracy. The Dark Elves didn't want the clan to be sent into the Void as punishment for spreading technology to humans. That was just a convenient excuse. The clan was banished to the Void to build a bridge for Arronax to return to this world and wreak destruction once again. Stenna, the dwarf you met right at the start in the wreckage of the crashed blimp, used this bridge to escape the Void and intended to warn the world about Arronax's return. It's from this point on that all those fantasy cliches hinted at in the first few hours start collapsing in delightful fashion. You aren't the reincarnation of Nasrudin at all. In fact, Nasrudin isn't even dead. The Panerai have been worshipping a bunch of bones that don't even belong to an elf and therefore can't be Nasrudin. Nasrudin is alive and relatively well on the island of Thanatos, where he's been living for 2,000 years. Nasrudin was never a god, he was simply the most powerful mage in Arcanum at the time. Arronax was his son. Arronax feared the rise of technology and led a destructive war against the Vendigroth, and for this Arronax was banished to the Void by the Elven Council. Nasrudin knows of a weapon that can defeat Arronax, located in the old city of Vendigroth. Once there, you find the remains of a 2,000-year-old city still populated by old robots, but not a lot else following the war with Arronax's army. The Vendigroth were an advanced civilization, probably more advanced than any of the cities currently thriving on Arcanum. There are a bunch of old newspapers lying around the remains of the city which mention universities, engineering schools and hospitals. Newspapers are used all over the game to communicate information about changes in the world, often reflecting things you've done. I love the way these are used, and according to Tim Kaine it was difficult to develop this and yet was rarely reflected in reviews of the game at the time, which is a shame. Once you have the Vendigroth device to defeat Arronax, Nasrudin sends you to the Void where you do indeed find the remains of the Black Mountain clan. However, it wasn't Arronax that put them to work building a bridge between Arcanum and the Void. Instead it was Kurgan, another of the evil beings sent to the Void. Kurgan imprisoned Arronax and pretended to be him to convince the Dark Elves to help with the bridge. Arronax has used the last 2,000 years to think, and he seems to largely regret his actions. If you trust Arronax, you can free him, and he will even join your team to help in the final battle, as will Krakatur and Gorgoth if you find them. I highly recommend you do this if you plan to fight Kurgan because it's an incredibly tough fight otherwise, as is much of the final dungeon. I'd largely been finding things easy going up until this point, cruising through with the battles in real time, albeit often on easy. In fact, I was so comfortable that it didn't overly bother me when my two ogre companions lost their admittedly flimsy armour and started fighting in their underwear. I probably should have done more to prepare. These last few hours were a huge slog, not just the fight against Kurgan but all his knights as well. Once you reach Kurgan, he asks if you've spoken to Arronax, Krakatur and Gorgoth, even if they're already there with you. He's powerful, but he's not all that bright. Kurgan won't go down as one of the more memorable antagonists in games simply because he's barely in it, only popping up once before this point, and he was pretending to be Arronax at the time. That said, he's an interesting fellow with, believe it or not, a half decent reason for wanting to return to Arcanum and destroy every living being. As part of Kurgan's experiments with necromancy, he visited the afterlife and saw the souls trapped between life and death. These souls are in constant pain but refuse to release their grasp on the land of the living. Kurgan then moved on to where souls go to die, and there he found peace, enlightenment and truth. This is what the afterlife should be like, but the living beings of Arcanum won't let go of their dead and vice versa, leaving the dead stuck in painful limbo. Kurgan wants everyone to experience the bliss that comes with letting go of life, but unfortunately that does mean going on a bit of a killing spree. Kurgan isn't lying or trying to trick us. If you still have Virgil on your team late in the game, he leaves your group to confront the people who killed his brother. In the process, Virgil dies, although he's easily resurrected with a convenient scroll placed nearby. In that brief period of death, Virgil also experienced the afterlife, and he can back up what Kurgan tells you. There's nothing a CRPG can do more to impress me than to give me a choice to talk my way out of the final boss confrontation. That's one of the reasons why the conversation with the Master at the end of Fallout 1 was so compelling, and it's largely replicated here, although it isn't quite as captivating. You essentially just convince Kurgan that he's blinded by his own experiences, and that not everyone shares his perspective. I didn't find this as cool as pointing out a huge flaw in the Master's plans, namely that his mutants were sterile. Another thing copied from Fallout is the ending slides that attempt to sum up the consequences of your decisions throughout the game. For fans of those early Fallout games, the ending slides are as core to the whole experience as Pip-Boys and Vault experiments. Arcanums are nowhere near as well implemented. For starters, they seem to be bugged or broken in some way. On my first ending, I got a couple of quick slides detailing the consequences of my actions in Shrouded Hills and Tarrant, and then it cut off abruptly. I went back to replay the ending, except this time I took the 4 bad guys back to Arcanum with me. I expected this to have disastrous or at least slightly negative consequences, but instead I got one slide telling me that I saved the world and was regarded as a hero, and that was it. No slides for individual locations this time. Strangely, on one of the endings where I didn't take Aranax back with me, I was told that I had, and that he ends up bringing Vendigroth back to its former glory. The slides wouldn't have been especially interesting anyway because I wasn't that engaged with the events of the local towns, certainly not in the same way I was with Fallout 1 and 2. With the towns being so large and in most cases sophisticated, I never felt like I was having a huge impact on them with the exception of Caledon and the whole Unified Kingdom quest that we'll see later. So Arcanum's story doesn't exactly set the world alight, but after starting slowly and predictably it takes a few twists and turns that I didn't expect, and it ends up being an incredibly enjoyable experience. The threat of Kurgan is real and imminent, but because it's not some epic fantasy tale, it could be followed up with new and interesting stories. Arcanum, much like Fallout, isn't just about the story it tells. It establishes a world in which there are plenty more stories waiting to be told. That never happened for Arcanum, of course. We know that the planned sequel was to be a journey to the centre of Arcanum. However, other ideas spring to mind as well based on the untold stories hinted at here. Will the power of magic continue to fade? Is technology the reason magic is fading? What happened to the people of Vendigroth? A world where magical elves living in treetops coexist alongside blimps and now aeroplanes is inherently one full of potential. So while this sounds like an incredibly cliche thing to say, I would love to see more stories set in this world. Regarding the ending, I'm a touch disappointed that the conflict between magic and technology didn't play out a little more. I found the magic/technology conflict to be the most intriguing part of the story. However, once we start chasing after elves and the void, we largely leave behind all thoughts of technological development. Kurgan doesn't mention it, with his motivation focusing on the afterlife instead. The ending didn't need to revolve around technology versus magic. It could be something more subtle, like impacting the weapon used to defeat Kurgan. When Nasruddin states that we need to destroy Aranax, we could have been given a choice between hunting down a technological weapon and a magic weapon, with a line or two in the ending slides to reflect this choice. It could be something as simple as saying, by defeating Kurgan with the magical whatever, you have proved that magic is still a force of power in this world, and vice versa if you use technology. Still, you can't do everything in one story, and as the first project for a new studio working with a demanding publisher, it's clear there were time constraints. Side quests are generally strong, although you'll need some patience because they often can't be completed until hours or even tens of hours after you've been assigned them. For example, if you explore around the crash blimp right at the start of the game, you'll find a camera and one of the planes that shot you down. I traded in the camera to a local in Shrouded Hills for information about the ring. He wanted a piece of modern technology and the camera seemed to fit the bill. Tens of hours later I had to go and buy the camera back when I met the inventor of the planes who wanted proof that they could fly because he'd become a bit of a laughingstock. Then there's the quest with a werewolf on the loose in Caledon. It's obvious the werewolf in question is the farmer's daughter, and sure enough, if you wait around at night you can catch her in the act. You tell the father and he asks you to keep it a secret. I was expecting the quest to end there, however he then asks you to keep an eye out for a cure from a mage, who you likely won't meet until quite near the end of the game. I also liked the quests tied to mastering your skills. As discussed, I put character points into Persuasion and Gunsmith, but beyond just spending points, you can also pay certain people to level up your skills to Apprentice, Expert and Master. This isn't instead of a character point, it's in addition to it, and it grants bonuses like an extra follower if you're an expert in Persuasion, and a reduced penalty on the targeted shots if you're an expert in firearms. Apprentice and Expert are quite easy to level up. The training is offered by multiple people and all you need is the money to pay them. Reaching Master level is tougher, with only one person of the requisite skill per category available to level you up, and they demand you complete a special side quest. The Persuasion Master quest is excellent. You're given the task of convincing the King of Caledon to join the Unified Kingdom. Instead of just moving through a bunch of conversation options, you have to remember 10 different points of negotiation and what is acceptable and what is not. Some positions are more flexible than others, such as the number of years Caledon won't have to pay the tax, while you're expected to be firm on others, like the number of votes they will have on the council. I love quests that have me taking a bunch of notes beforehand, and that's definitely what I had to do here. We moved through the questions and I tried to take as strong a stance as possible, but did expect some pushback. I didn't get any. This was the one disappointing part of the quest. I had hoped to battle the points back and forth and eventually make some tough decisions and compromises. Instead, you just give your stance on everything in one go and get a yes or no answer at the end. Or at least that's what happened the couple of times I tried. I restarted after my first attempt and was even stricter, but they still said yes. So yeah, this quest certainly could have been executed better, however you don't get many chances to negotiate huge treaties like this one, so I enjoyed it. The Gunsmith Master quest didn't work out quite so well. You're tasked with going and rescuing a hostage from a group of armed thugs. This is one of those fights that I absolutely had to play in turn-based mode to even get through, and even then there were a few failed attempts. The problem was that whenever I did succeed, the hostage was already dead. I restarted a few times trying to sneak up on the gang instead of heading straight into the building, but the woman was dead well before the fighting even started. I wasn't told that stealth would be necessary, nor should it be anyway, because this is specifically a test of your skills with a gun, not your gun skills and your stealth skills. Anyway, it wasn't a huge deal, but I had to accept there was no way to complete this quest, short of retracing an hour of previous gameplay and seeing if it turned out differently a second time. As seems to often be the case with these CRPGs, there are more possible companions than most people will ever get to play with, and they vary a lot in how much they add to the overall experience beyond their abilities in combat. From my experience, most companions here were fairly inactive with no special story missions to speak of. The main exception to this is Virgil, who takes an active role from the very start when he proclaims you as the living one and occasionally acts weird when confronted with his brother's past. He's a great companion to have around, even though in my case his healing efforts were largely worthless. The other companion of note is Magnus Shalefist, who you meet early on outside Schuyler and Sons when you're investigating the Strange Ring. Magnus is desperate to be taken seriously as a true dwarf and not a city dwarf. However, he has to carry around a book to remind him of dwarven traditions, and he's clearly not as well versed as he likes to pretend. If you develop a close relationship, he will eventually loosen up and admit that he isn't a native dwarf. Chucker is a weird one. He's an ogre who serves baits, but he can be recruited to fight alongside you. Ogres are incredibly useful in a fight, however he insists on picking up absolutely everything. I was trying to dump a cursed weapon, except wherever I dropped it he would pick it up. He even picked up a massive rock that filled nearly his entire inventory. This does come in useful later on when it's part of a quest, but yeah, I could do without him stealing huge rocks from random fields. Strangely, there are a few companions who will join you for a very limited amount of time while you escort them back to a certain location. If you detour at all, they will keep complaining and will soon leave if you don't make an effort to get them there. It's slightly strange that Troika went to the effort of including companions that were so limited in their effectiveness. You want to keep them alive and deliver them to their destination because it's a quest that rewards XP, and yet you don't want to give them too much stuff to use because they could leave at any second. Arcanum's mixture of good story and world building combined with bad combat sounds a lot like Fallout 1 in particular, but Arcanum has a problem Fallout didn't have. Namely a tendency to pad out the entire experience, most notably through a bunch of boring dungeons. Now most RPGs have dungeons, after all many of them are based on Dungeons and Dragons. You typically traipse through around 4 floors before reaching a boss or mini-boss that rounds out part of the story or a side quest. Fallout didn't rely on dungeons to the same extent. You occasionally needed to head into caves to kill a particular rad scorpion or something, but that was about it. Vaults were structured like dungeons with multiple floors to explore, although you often didn't do that much killing. Well, not unless you wanted to anyway. I tend to associate proper RPG dungeons as ones where you need to plough through a bunch of enemies to reach a boss at the end. They are typically maze-like, but there's some sense to the randomness, and the good ones look like they were either formed naturally or carved out of rocks in a slightly haphazard manner, as you would expect of mining work. You also usually meet a few friendlies along the way who ask you to find a particular person or return a piece of jewellery. Arcanum has the huge dungeon areas more comparable to those traditional RPGs than Fallout, and my god they are so incredibly boring. First of all, they are visually uninteresting to look at. They are mazes with a bunch of twists and turns that don't feel like real areas in the slightest. Just look at these sewers underneath the city of Tarrant. Sewers are designed to transport water and waste. They generally have a lot of straight lines leading towards a particular destination. Arcanum's sewers are a bunch of right angles everywhere. The reason the sewers in Arcanum are structured this way can only be to make the play area underneath Tarrant as large and time consuming as possible to explore. There's no flow or structure to any of it. You just keep pushing through and choosing between different routes with no end goal in sight. Well, let's be fair, sewers are never the sexiest of places at the best of times, but there are ways to make them worth exploring. For example, good loot, tough fights, story quests, NPCs, and maybe a few light puzzles would help pass the time. But there's hardly any good loot for a start, not enough to make it worth the time you spend out here. There are some tough fights, however with multiple entrance points to the sewers, it doesn't feel like there's any inherent build up to the major battles. I would be exploring and killing a bunch of goons when suddenly a tough enemy approached. After killing that one I expected to find some loot or an item related to a side quest, but nope. Around the next corner there would simply be maybe a bunch more of that tough enemy, and a bit later we'd be back to easy ones again. There is some stuff to do down here. You can find a guy's wedding ring, although in that case it's incredibly close to where you meet him, so it doesn't require much effort. I don't want to imply that the sewers can or should be skipped entirely, however the general maze-like nature of these areas means it's not uncommon to spend ages down here and not accomplish anything. You then have to work your way back to an open exit and go back down later, traipsing through the same bland corridors again as you retrace your steps. Sometimes I had to leave because I ran out of bullets despite stocking up on over 200 before going in. This area turned out to only be good for levelling up a bit. The other dungeons are slightly better than the sewers, with at least some major reason for you being there, but they still suffer from problems such as a lack of interesting loot and an over-reliance on meaningless mazes. A good dungeon is perhaps maze-like, after all we're underground and these tunnels likely weren't created with a specific start and endpoint in mind, but they shouldn't look like hedge mazes where every inch of space is used except for the walls. I don't recall puzzles being used at all unless you consider finding your way through to the next floor puzzle, which to be fair could be a little unclear at times. Perhaps a good comparison is the randomly generated dungeons of Skyrim. Many of the dungeons in Skyrim aren't so much locations to explore with stories to tell as they are content to be completed. A place to move through with a bunch of enemies to kill so that you feel like the game is huge when much of the time you spend in it is narratively empty. I wouldn't be surprised at all if these dungeons were another Sierra Entertainment edict. Diablo was popular at the time, so the idea of real-time combat in bland dungeons probably didn't seem all that off-putting. You only have to look at the red health bar and the blue energy bar to see some Diablo influence on screen. Even outside of dungeons, quest design is a little uninspired, with quests often feeling like they were designed to be as long as possible instead of as enjoyable as possible. Near the end of the story you need to speak to Pelosian, a ghost who only appears at midnight near a pool. Before speaking to him you have to solve a puzzle. Figuring out the puzzle isn't too challenging. You're told to look at a picture and this provides enough information to figure out which buttons relating to schools of magic need to be pressed in which order. Of course you can't just press the buttons like entering the code on a keypad. You instead need to walk around and stand on the correct logos in the correct order, and these are all fairly spaced out. Unless you memorise the location of each, you end up slowly walking around this area a bunch of times to stand on the 4 correct logos, which opens up one of the doors. And then you do this 3 more times. By itself this quest wouldn't be worth mentioning, but it comes near the end of the game and for me it just perfectly encapsulated how everything in Arcanum takes longer than it needs to. Like a YouTube video essayist going on and on just to make their videos longer than they need to be so they can shove more adverts in there and hopefully make people think their videos are intellectual just because they're long, and really all that does. There were 3 quests that required me to dig up graves, which feels like 2 more than is necessary. 2 of these quests came right after the other as well. To make matters worse, I got rid of the shovel after the first game because I figured there's no way I'd need to use a shovel again, and then I had to do a bunch of backtracking to find a new one. If there's a grave that needs digging, then as a rule of thumb, the item you use to dig the grave should be available in that location. It's a bit silly to spend in-game days or even weeks travelling across the country for a shovel. Near the end, you have to do a bunch of quests for a character called Stringy Pete, and they don't fit into the story at all. You only do them because you need his boat to get to the island of Thanatos, which no one will take you to. Well, technically you can buy a boat without doing these quests, but it costs 50,000 gold, so I expect most people will do the quests. Then there were the missions with good ideas that failed in the execution. For example, I was tasked with using a device to close a portal. Enemies kept spawning out of the portal, so no matter how many I killed, I couldn't get close enough to it. I tried thinking of other options, wondering whether one of my crew could sneak up close enough to use it. This was way overthinking the problem. You don't need to get close to the portal at all. So long as you can see the portal to click on it, you can use the device wherever you are. A touch disappointing. Something similar plays out with a quest where you need to catch a monster that's disguised as a rabbit, although it turns out that it's just a normal rabbit. When you're given the quest, it sounds like you might need to sneak up on the rabbit and be careful, but again, you just use the trap from the other side of the screen. Oh, and it's the same with digging graves with the shovels. I'm not sure what the devs were going for here. Maybe these quests were going to be a little more involved, but they couldn't figure out how to do it in the engine and just gave up. Just navigating the map can be a huge pain. You have to move to the edge of the map to access the world map, except the boundaries of the map aren't clearly marked. You just have to keep walking in one direction until the map icon changes to a globe. Bearing in mind how big some of the maps are and how often they are walled off, this can be a huge pain. The world map is actually one continuous map. You can walk from one end to the other without ever hitting a loading screen, although walking from end to end would apparently take 35 hours, and that's assuming you don't stop at all or hit any random encounters. Moving from city to city is a lot slower than I'd like, and it's a huge pain when you have to traipse from city to city just to complete a side quest. I know you can save up quests and do them all in one go when you get to the right city, however sometimes this means you're lugging around large and heavy objects for hours. Plus I just don't like having a bunch of half-completed quests clogging up my journal. You end up choosing between leaving quests in your journal for ages, or travelling from one end of the map to the other, then walking through an entire city for a short conversation, which sends you back to the other end of the map again. Arcanum was a buggy mess on release, and while patches improved the situation somewhat, there are still a bunch of problems, with the main one being the appalling frame rate during real-time combat. There don't have to be many enemies on screen for the whole thing to grind to a crawl. You're also limited in how far you can move the camera from your team. All the walking around wouldn't have been so bad if I could have clicked on the opposite end of the map and just waited while they walked over, but instead you have to move them across the map inch by inch. If you see video footage of empty city streets, then it's me slowly trying to drag my team where I need them to be. Of course there are other niggles as well. Combat breaks quite often when you fight in doorways, and the weights of items are often nonsensical, with for example a massive statue only weighing 1/3 of a small book. Arcanum of Steamworks and Magick Obscura is the result of a small team of incredibly talented developers biting off a little more than they could chew. It feels like exactly what it is, a new IP by the people who made Fallout, except they didn't quite have the time or resources to implement all their ambitions. The need for 2 different combat systems means we're left with 2 bad choices instead of 1 good one, and I'm convinced Sierra Entertainment insisted Arcanum take upwards of 40 hours to complete, when there's a much better 25-hour game in here. I'd love to recommend Arcanum as a hidden gem. It's certainly special, but with so much time wasting I can't insist you play it. I have no problem with games being long or requiring a bit of patience. It was only a couple of months ago that I spent 80 hours with Baldur's Gate 2 after all. However, Arcanum needs more than patience. It needs perseverance and a desire to endure a lot of tedium for some reward. To sidetrack a bit, playing Arcanum reminds me of one summer about 15 years ago. My summer job had finished, but I didn't start back at university for another 2 weeks. I didn't have any money and couldn't move into my new house yet, which meant I was stranded at my parents' place. For some reason, I decided it'd be a good idea to use those 2 weeks to read War and Peace. After all, when else was I going to have the time or inclination to read it? I knew that if I tried reading it just like any other book, I would never make it to the end because it would take so damn long. So I set myself the task of powering through it when I had no other responsibilities and the weather was nice outside, well, by British standards at least. I didn't hate it. In fact, there were many sections where I was fairly gripped and didn't have to force my way through in the slightest. I'm glad I read War and Peace, and yet I would never recommend anyone else do the same simply because my enjoyment wasn't commensurate with the time I spent with it. This probably won't come as a huge surprise, but yeah, War and Peace is a bit bloated in places, with literally hundreds of pages that could be cut out with no great loss to anyone. I liked War and Peace and I liked Arcanum. I'm glad I read and played them, but in neither case can I say with any confidence that you need to do the same. I'm not going to stop you from experiencing either. If the good stuff sounds intriguing enough, then go ahead, just be prepared to spend a lot of time dealing with unengaging content. It's not really a pacing issue either. Arcanum's pacing is consistent from beginning to end, it's just consistently too slow for my tastes. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video on Arcanum of Steamworks and Magick Obscura. I know it's a bit more negative than many of you would have liked, but I didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much as I'd hoped, and well, that obviously gets reflected in the video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting like, sharing and subscribing if you haven't already. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to sign up for $1 a month, which gets your name in the credits, and a Patreon role in my Discord server. The next game in this series on the history of isometric CRPGs will be Temple of Elemental Evil, also by Troika Games. I don't plan to cover Icewind Dale 2 because from what I can tell it doesn't add much to the experience of the first one, which I found a real slog. If there are any other isometric CRPGs that you think I should cover before I leap forward in time to Divinity Original Sin, then now is the time to let me know in the comments. I was supposed to get a video out on Splinter Cell Pandora tomorrow this month, but it doesn't look like that will happen. I might even save it until after the Witcher 2 video just to make sure I don't lag behind on that series. July was a little unproductive for me. I don't know why, but this script just would not come together. I don't know if it was writer's block or laziness disguised as writer's block, but whatever the answer, the words would just not come. Oh, and I also adopted a cat. I'll do my best to make August far more productive. Alright, until next time, cheers.